July 18, 1943. The sun pressed down on the siding outside a small town in Texas, baking the rails until they shimmered like liquid metal. The train screeched to a halt, brakes screaming, wheels grinding sparks into the air. Dust rose in thick clouds, and inside the Pullman cars German prisoners leaned against the glass, eyes narrowed against the light. The smell was strange to them, coal smoke mixed with fresh hay and the sweetness of ripening cornfields. Cicadas shrieked so loudly it felt like the earth itself was vibrating. They had been soldiers of Rommel's Afrika Korps, men who once believed themselves the sharpest edge of the Reich. Now they shuffled. Unshaven, uniforms frayed, boots cracked from desert marsh, defeat clung to them like a second skin. They braced for hostility, for jeers, for the humiliation of enemies gloating over their capture. But what they saw unsettled them more than hostility could. On the platform stood townsfolk farmers in clean cotton shirts, wives shielding their eyes beneath broad-brimmed hats, children clutching bottles of Coca-Cola that fizzed in the heat. They came not to spit or throw stones, but to stare in open curiosity. And as guards called out to direct the men, the names floated across the platform in the July air. Herr Schneider, Herr Bauer, Herr Muller. Corporal Hans Mertens, a farmer's son from Bavaria, scribbled in a diary later hidden under his mattress, "I thought I would see cowboys, Jews, and Negroes. Instead, I heard our own names spoken with American accents." They had our names. It was the first crack in a carefully constructed world. To realize that here, thousands of miles from Europe, the faces waiting in the heat belonged to Americans with German surnames. Descendants of people who had tilled this soil long before Hitler had ever spoken of destiny. And before we dive further, if you enjoy uncovering these hidden chapters of World War II, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps bring more of these untold stories to light. The train doors clanged open, metal against metal, and the prisoners shuffled into the glare. Guards formed neat ranks, rifles slung, but their stance was loose, casual, almost apologetic. What stunned the Germans was not the discipline but the backdrop. Acres upon acres of farmland stretched beyond sight, cotton swaying like white surf. Silos stabbing the horizon, red barns with roofs brighter than any European village. And behind the soldiers stood the farmers, some speaking in a German softened by years of English, others switching between the two tongues as if the line never mattered. "Mein Gott," murmured Sergeant Wilhelm Krause, son of a barley farmer near Königsberg. "They sound like my grandfather." The Reich had painted America as mongrel, decadent, collapsing under its own corruption. Yet here were men who looked familiar, voices that echoed the dialects of Swabia and Bavaria, of Prussia and Saxony. They bore German names but American prosperity, and they lived in houses that gleamed with tin roofs, drove trucks painted in fresh enamel, sent their children to school with full stomachs. Trucks rumbled in with produced watermelons split wide to show crimson flesh dripping in the heat, baskets of tomatoes still smelling of vine, crates of eggs stacked impossibly high. Farmers unloaded them with laughter, sometimes shouting to one another in German, sometimes in English. The POWs, gaunt from desert rations, watched with hollow eyes. This was not a feast laid out for spectacle. This was casual abundance, delivered without ceremony, as if plenty were normal. Lieutenant Dieter Weiss later recorded, "They threw eggs into baskets with the same carelessness we threw rocks at birds." To them, eggs meant nothing. To us, they meant life. The shock deepened when the men realized just how many Americans carried their heritage. By 1943, more than 14 million citizens of the United States identified as German American. In Texas, entire towns bore names like New Braunfels and Fredericksburg. In Minnesota, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and Ohio, German was still spoken in churches, still printed in newspapers, still used in lullabies whispered to children at night. These farmers were not relics. They were the backbone of the Midwest and the South, part of the agricultural engine feeding an army that stretched across the globe. The statistics themselves were merciless. In Germany, a farmer with good soil might coax 30 bushels of wheat per acre. In Kansas or Iowa, 60 bushels was normal, sometimes more. Harvested not by sweating families with scythes, but by tractors and combines roaring through fields in hours. Germany hitched horses to plows. Here, teenagers guided machines worth more than an officer's yearly pay. Sergeant Vogel, once proud of his family's rye farm near Leipzig, stared as a boy of 16 drove a green John Deere tractor past their work detail. The engine purred, the tires were taller than a man, and the boy waved with the casual arrogance of youth. Vogel whispered, "That machine is worth more than everything my father owns." His comrade answered, "And the boy laughs because he will replace it soon with something better." The POWs were sent in small groups to surrounding farms, bound by Geneva Convention restrictions but desperately needed in a nation where young men had gone to war. They hoed cotton, pulled sugar beets, repaired fences, and in every task they confronted the same reality: abundance. Captain Karl Vogel, once a decorated officer of the 21st Panzer Division, was assigned to work for a farmer named Muller. The name made him suspicious, at first a trap, he thought, but Muller was no interrogator. He was the grandson of Baden immigrants who had arrived in Texas in the 1850s. His German was old-fashioned, but fluent. "You fight for Hitler," Muller said during a water break, wiping sweat with a red kerchief. "But my grandfather left Germany because of men like him." Vogel studied him. Here was a man with sunburnt skin and calloused hands, prosperous in ways a German farmer could only dream. His wife drove to town in a Chevrolet, his daughter played piano after dinner, his barn had electric lights. He was ordinary by American standards, extraordinary by German ones. That night Vogel wrote in his notebook, "We believed only the right could guarantee prosperity for Germans. Today I saw prosperity without the Reich, and it spoke with my language." Even small details became blows to ideology. At lunch, the prisoners were given sandwiches with thick slices of beef, lettuce crisp with dew, and white bread so soft it seemed unreal. In Germany, meat was rationed to 200 grams per week when available. Here, it was daily fare. American guards tossed half-eaten sandwiches into trash bins, not with cruelty, but with indifference. Feldwebel Otto Kretschmann wrote, "They waste what we pray for. They eat like kings without noticing it. If this is normal, then everything we were told is lies." The revelations continued as days turned into weeks. The Germans discovered that these American farmers, with their surnames and dialects, were not second-class citizens. They were respected, influential, and integrated. Some were Lutheran, some Catholic, some Baptist, but all were free. Their German roots were not shackles. They were part of a mosaic. Private Heinrich Bauer, a shoemaker's son from Hamburg, listened in disbelief as an old farmer explained that his son was away at college studying engineering. In Germany, universities were still bastions of the elite. Here, a farmer's son could aspire to become an engineer, a lawyer, even a politician. "Impossible," Bauer muttered. "No," the farmer replied with a smile. America. The psychological demolition was not immediate, but it was relentless. Every field harvested, every barn stocked, every farmhouse refrigerator humming with abundance wore down the edifice of Nazi belief. In a letter intercepted by censors, Obergefreiter Hans Muller confessed, "We thought America was ruled by Jews and Negroes. We thought it was collapsing. Instead, I see farms larger than our provinces, tractors greater than our armies, and families who live better than our officers. If this is collapse, then what is victory?" The question hung like a shadow across the camps, echoing louder with each passing week. By the time August heat settled heavy over the plains, the Germans had learned something more devastating still. These farmers who spoke their tongue, who bore their names, who lived in prosperity beyond the Reich's dreams, were loyal Americans. They had chosen this new world, and in their choice lay a verdict. Because what the prisoners saw was not just abundance, it was freedom. Freedom to farm without party quotas. Freedom to worship without fear. Freedom to prosper without marching under banners. And for the men who had marched behind swastikas through the deserts of Africa, that realization was more disorienting than defeat itself. August 1943. The Texas sun blazed white across cotton fields, bleaching the sky until even shadows seemed to hide from it. German prisoners bent under the weight of burlap sacks, sweat pouring down their backs, hands blistered from labor. They had worked in deserts before, but this was different. This land was alive, fertile, overflowing with crops that seemed to grow faster than they could be picked. For Sergeant Wilhelm Krause, it was like being transported into a dream. He had left behind a family struggling on a small farm near Königsberg, where black soil yielded meager barley and potatoes, where ration cards determined whether bread arrived at the table at all. Here, in America, food rose from the earth in endless supply. Even the weeds seemed healthier than the vegetables of home. During their breaks, they sat under pecan trees, and the farmers' children approached without fear. They offered water from tin cups, sometimes passing around cookies wrapped in wax paper. The prisoners muttered thanks in halting English, but the children laughed and answered in German, taught by grandparents who still prayed in the old tongue. Private Ernst Hoffmann wrote in a letter smuggled through the censors. The farmer's daughter spoke German better than I spoke English. She asked me if I missed my home. I could not answer. How could I tell her that my home never had food like this, never had machines like this, never had children laughing in peace? The numbers sharpened the shock. In Germany, a farmer might harvest 20 or 30 quintals of grain per hectare. Here, in Nebraska, Iowa, and Texas, farmers doubled that yield with hybrid seed, fertilizer, and mechanization. A single combine harvester could do the work of 100 men, rumbling across the fields like a ship crossing an ocean of gold. In 1943, America produced over 3.3 billion bushels of corn, while German agriculture, strained by war and blockade, struggled to feed both civilians and soldiers. Farmers in Ohio and Kansas could afford to plow under crops to stabilize prices, while German families scraped together acorns to stretch their bread. The POWs watched grain elevators swallow harvests that dwarfed the entire production of their provinces. One farmer named Schneider explained proudly that his county alone produced more wheat than all of Saxony. The Germans laughed nervously, thinking it exaggeration, until they saw the elevator's tall, concrete cathedrals filled with endless grain. Obergefreiter Karl Brenner wrote, "They stored more food in one tower than my entire city consumed in a year, and they spoke of it as if it were ordinary." The ideological cracks widened during conversations with the farmers themselves. Men named Muller, Bauer, Keller, names the Germans recognized as their own, spoke of their fathers who had emigrated in the 19th century. They spoke of land grants, of hard work, of opportunities denied in the old country. Some spoke of leaving behind the militarism and poverty of Prussia, seeking instead the promise of freedom in the New World. One farmer in Texas told his POW workers, "My grandfather said in Germany a man could serve the Kaiser all his life and never own more than a strip of land. Here, we own what we till. No party decides, no general demands, just the weather, the soil, and our labor." For prisoners raised on slogans about Lebensraum, living space won by conquest, the irony was devastating. Here was land stretching beyond the horizon, richer than any in Europe, and it had been claimed not by armies but by families. The POWs' daily labor revealed the scale of American prosperity. They picked cotton with machines that dwarfed them, hauled water from pumps powered by electricity, and saw barns fitted with cooling fans that ran day and night. Many had never experienced electricity in their own homes in Germany. Rural electrification had reached only a fraction of German villages before the war. In America, by the 1930s, even isolated farms were wired, their nights lit with bulbs, their work aided by motors. Feldwebel Heinrich Bauer, who had once believed electricity was a luxury, wrote in his diary, "Here even the chicken coops have light bulbs. In my town, our whole street had one lamp." The casual wealth of American farmers struck harder than any statistic. They drank Coca-Cola in the fields, tossing glass bottles into bins without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, often extinguishing them half-finished. A German soldier would have hoarded every stub. Farmers' wives prepared lunches of thick ham sandwiches, potato salad, pies bursting with fruit. They handed leftovers to prisoners with an ease that stunned them. Oberleutnant Vogel remembered, "They gave us apple pie as if it were bread." In Germany, such pie would have been a feast for Christmas. The contradictions piled up like an avalanche. Nazi propaganda had promised that America was weak, decadent, collapsing under racial chaos. But here, the Germans saw black farmhands working alongside white, Mexican migrants picking rows of cotton, women driving tractors, teenagers handling machinery. Production never slowed. Stabs Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, once a strict party member, confessed later, "We were told a mixed society would collapse. But the Negro drove a tractor worth more than my house. The women welded steel. The boys repaired machines. And everything worked. Nothing collapsed." It was a vision of strength through diversity, deficiency through democracy, an unanswerable contradiction to the ideology they had carried from Africa. At night, when they returned to the barracks, the prisoners spoke in whispers. They compared notes, recited statistics, argued in low voices. The most loyal Nazis insisted it was all a show staged by the Americans, a propaganda theater to weaken them. But the evidence was too overwhelming. They had walked the fields, touched the machines, eaten the food. No theater could fake abundance on this scale. By September, the labor program expanded. Groups of prisoners were shipped north to Nebraska and Kansas, to sugar beet fields and wheat farms. There, the revelations multiplied. A single farmer's son, barely 16, guided a harvester that produced in one day more than an entire German village in a month. Private Joseph Lang wrote in disbelief, "The boy drove the machine with one hand while eating a sandwich with the other. He laughed when I said the tractor cost more than my father's house. He said it was an old model. His father was waiting for a new one from John Deere." For many, the greatest humiliation was seeing prosperity among those considered ordinary, not party officials, not junker aristocrats, not officers, but common farmers. Men who wore work shirts, whose wives sold eggs at markets, whose children ran barefoot through fields. And yet they possessed tractors, cars, refrigerators, radios, luxuries beyond the reach of most German officers. One POW, a former schoolteacher, recorded bitterly, "We fought for the Reich, believing we would bring prosperity to our people. But these farmers, who owe nothing to Berlin, live better than our generals." It was not our victories that fed us, it was their harvests. The American guards noticed the change. At first, the posts were sullen, silent, clinging to the pride of soldiers. But as weeks passed, their eyes widened, their conversations lengthened, their questions multiplied. They asked about wages, about land prices, about how electricity reached every farm. They asked about elections, about schools, about whether farmers could criticize their government without punishment. One guard recalled years later, "They didn't want to escape anymore. They wanted to understand. They wanted to know how it worked, why ordinary people could live so well without orders from above." The climax of revelation came during the harvest fairs. Local towns invited the POWs under guard to see livestock competitions, machinery exhibitions, even rodeos. There, the Germans saw families dressed in their Sunday best, children clutching balloons, farmers boasting of cattle and hogs heavier than anything in Europe. They saw tractors gleaming under banners, new models advertised as casually as bicycles. They tasted barbecue piles of beef that in Germany could have fed a family for weeks. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote with awe, "They eat meat like bread. They build machines like toys. They waste what we cannot imagine possessing, and all of it is normal. By the time autumn painted the fields gold, the prisoners had experienced not just defeat, but a dismantling of their world. The Reich had promised that only conquest could feed the German people, that only dictatorship could create order. But on American farms, worked by free citizens, guided by families with German names, the prisoners saw proof that prosperity came not from conquest but from freedom, not from propaganda but from production. And that truth was harder to bear than captivity. October 1943. The nights grew colder in the heartland. Frost crept across fields of corn stubble, and the wind carried the smell of smoke from farmhouses burning wood in iron stoves. For the German prisoners, the rhythm of work on the land was giving way to a new assignment: factories, rail yards, sawmills. The demand for labor pulled them deeper into the machinery of American life, where the scale of abundance revealed itself in steel, electricity, and power beyond their comprehension. They traveled in guarded trucks through towns that seemed to glow even at night. Lights blazed from windows, neon signs flickered along main streets, theaters advertised Hollywood films. For men used to blackouts, to streets patrolled in darkness since 1940, the sight was unnerving. Obergefreiter Hans Muller whispered to his companion as they passed through a Missouri town at midnight, "There are more lights here than in all of Hamburg." His friend answered quietly, "And they leave them burning, even when no one is inside." The waste was dazzling. To the prisoners, electricity was rationed, precious, something to be measured. Here it flowed without restraint, illuminating empty shops, humming through streetcars, powering refrigerators that ran night and day. Their first assignment was at a sawmill in Arkansas. Prisoners watched mechanized blades devour logs in seconds, producing lumber in quantities that left them stunned. Machines did the work of entire companies of men, and women operated the controls with ease. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a carpentry shop before the war, later recalled, "One woman, perhaps 50 years old, monitored dials and levers. She produced in one shift what a dozen of us could not have done in a week in Germany. She drank coffee while she worked, and the machine never slowed." The statistics told the rest. The United States produced 36 billion board feet of lumber in 1943, more than enough to build barracks, ships, and entire towns. Germany, starving for resources, tore down old buildings to salvage wood. The POWs saw with their own eyes why America could raise new camps in 90 days while their homeland struggled to patch bombed-out houses. Next came the factories. In Illinois, prisoners were marched past sprawling brick buildings that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Inside, conveyor belts hummed with hypnotic rhythm. Women riveted steel plates. Teenagers monitored gauges. Men guided cranes that swung tons of metal as casually as buckets of water. At a Campbell's soup plant in New Jersey, a small group of German prisoners assigned to loading work witnessed an assembly line that processed more tomatoes in a single day than an entire German cannery might handle in a month. The steam cookers roared, the belts clattered, cans rattled into boxes at dizzying speed. Wagner wrote, "One elderly woman pressed buttons and the entire process unfolded, washing, cutting, cooking, sealing." In Germany, 50 men would sweat for days to do the same work. She did it while listening to a radio. Transportation shocked them even more. Trains rolled by with cars stacked full of coal, wheat, and steel. In one Kansas rail yard, prisoners watched as automated loaders filled tenders with coal in 30 minutes, a task that would have taken hours in Europe. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an engineer before the war, calculated that a single yard consumed more electricity in 1 hour than his entire Berlin district in a day. He recorded, "They throw energy into the air as if it were air itself. Their waste is our dream." The scale was impossible to ignore. America had over 250,000 miles of railroad running like arteries through the land. German soldiers who once rode cramped in 40 and 8 cars, 40 men or 8 horses, now sat in cushioned Pullman coaches. Dining cars served meals on white tablecloths, even to prisoners. One guard apologized when the air conditioning faltered. Air conditioning. Most Germans had never even heard of such a thing. By November, the prisoners were escorted into the Midwest's industrial, Hart, Detroit, St. Louis, Chicago. Here the factories seemed like cities unto themselves. At the Ford Willow Run plant, some POWs glimpsed the vast structure where a B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. The building consumed 2.5 million square feet, employing tens of thousands. Prisoners gawked as assembly lines moved with relentless pace, wings and fuselages emerging as if conjured by magic. Unteroffizier Hans Keller, a Luftwaffe mechanic, pressed his face against the train window and counted bombers in various stages of completion. We were told they built planes hastily, that they would fall apart. But I saw them more precise than anything in Germany. They do not just build, they multiply. The Germans had struggled to produce thousands of aircraft. America produced tens of thousands. By war's end, over 18,000 B-24s would take flight, many from this single plant. The prisoners worked at auxiliary industries, coal yards, textile mills, food plants always forbidden from direct war production, but always close enough to glimpse it. They saw steel poured in rivers of fire, auto plants turned into tank factories, shipyards birthing Liberty ships in mere days. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners unloading supplies watched as furnaces poured out 10,000 tons of steel per day. One POW whispered, "They spill more steel on the floor than we can make in a week." The human element confounded them most. Women with hair tied back in scarves drove cranes and operated welding torches. Black workers guided trains of carts. Immigrants from Italy and Poland shouted directions. Production never faltered. Jeff writer Wilhelm Hoffmann, who had believed Nazi racial doctrine, wrote years later, "They told us such a society would collapse, but the opposite was true. They produced more than we imagined possible. The Negro, the woman, the immigrant, all working, all essential. It was a unity stronger than our purity." Even leisure revealed contradictions. Guards sometimes allowed prisoners to watch American films. They saw Gone with the Wind, watched a nation survive destruction and rebuild. They saw The Grapes of Wrath, astonished that Americans would show hardship and failure so openly. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer wrote, "In Germany, such films would mean prison or death. Here they call it patriotism to show their flaws. They hide nothing. Their honesty is strength." By winter, the effect was undeniable. The Special Projects Division, a secret branch monitoring POW psychology, noted a collapse of ideological resistance. Officers reported prisoners requesting American newspapers, English classes, even correspondence courses. Men who had once shouted slogans now sat quietly reading about democracy. Major Paul Noland wrote in December 1943, "The most fanatical no longer argue. They have seen too much. They whisper among themselves, but not of victory, only of survival." The final blow in 1943 came at Christmas. Churches, civic groups, and families sent 500,000 packages to POW camps. Cigarettes, candy, toiletries, even homemade cookies. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the Methodist choir sang carols in German. Women from town sent cakes, children drew cards. Oberleutnant Walter Muller, whose brother had died in Hamburg bombings, confessed in a letter, "They know we are their enemies, yet they show kindness. Not propaganda, but genuine kindness." What kind of people do this? Only those certain of victory, certain of themselves. The feast that night overwhelmed them. Turkey, ham, potatoes, pies, ice cream. Quantities that German civilians had not seen since 1914. Prisoners ate until sick, unable to believe such abundance could be lavished on enemies. Jeff writer Hans Bauer wrote simply, "If they feed prisoners this way, how must their own soldiers eat?" By the end of 1943, the Germans who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler now stared at America with disbelief. They had seen farms overflowing, factories roaring, cities glowing with electricity. They had eaten more in captivity than in freedom. And for the first time, many began to wonder not how Germany could win, but how it had ever believed it could. Spring 1944. The trains rattled north through the plains, carrying groups of German prisoners to new assignments. Outside the windows, wheat fields stretched so far they seemed to merge with the horizon, oceans of gold broken only by grain elevators that rose like fortresses. The prisoners had learned not to scoff at statistics anymore. They had touched the harvests, tasted the bread, worked the fields. Now they knew America could feed not only itself but armies across the seas, allies scattered across continents. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, once a farmer in East Prussia, stared at the combines moving across Kansas fields. "One American farmer," he whispered, "does the work of 100 Germans." He was not exaggerating. The machines swallowed acres and hours, and the elevators filled with mountains of grain, more than his entire province had ever produced. The prisoners were not blindfolded on these journeys. They passed towns glowing at night, factories humming without pause, highways filled with cars. They saw billboards advertising refrigerators, radios, tractors, goods unimaginable in Germany after years of war. The guards encouraged them to look to see. Observation itself was a weapon more devastating than propaganda. Some were assigned to California's Central Valley, where orchards ran to the horizon. They picked peaches, plums, and grapes in quantities that defied belief. And then came the most shattering sight: mountains of fruit bulldozed into pits. Oranges plowed under, not from shortage but from excess. Prices had to be stabilized, so abundance was destroyed. Jeff writer Otto Schultz wrote in anguish, "We begged them to send the fruit to Germany, to our starving families. They shook their heads. It could not be done. They destroyed food to keep order. We could not comprehend such waste, for to us waste meant death. To them, waste was proof of limitless supply." Others worked in canneries, where conveyor belts poured rivers of tomatoes into boiling vats, emerging as neat rows of cans stacked to the rafters. They saw women, elderly men, even high school boys running the machines, and still, production exceeded what German factories could have achieved at full strength. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner confessed in his notebook, "We believe the Reich commanded industry. But here even the women at the machines outproduced us. Their machines are our defeat." The destruction of ideology was no longer abstract. It was personal. For months, prisoners had labored on farms owned by men named Schneider, Bauer, Muller. Now they realized those names no longer belonged to Germany. They belonged to America, men who had left the old world behind, who prospered without party, without furor, without conquest. One farmer explained that his grandfather had fled Germany because of militarism. Seeking freedom in the New World, his son was now a lieutenant fighting with the U.S. Army in Italy. The POWs listened in silence. The irony was brutal. Descendants of Germans fought against the Reich, while captured Germans worked their land. Lieutenant Karl Vogel later reflected, "We believed we carried Germany's destiny. But these men carried Germany's name, and they lived better without it." By summer 1944, the ideological collapse was nearly complete. At Camp Hearn, at Fort Robinson, at dozens of camps across America, German prisoners signed up for education programs. They studied English, read American newspapers, listened to lectures on history and democracy. Universities sent professors. Libraries sent books. Prisoners debated economics, politics, even philosophy. One physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute attended lectures on atomic theory given by Jewish refugees who had fled Germany. He recorded in wonder, "They teach us without hatred. They are years ahead of our research. And they share their knowledge with prisoners." The honesty stunned them. American newspapers did not hide failures. Hollywood films showed poverty, corruption, struggle. To Germans, such candor would have meant prison. In America, it was a mark of strength. Oberleutnant Joseph Kramer wrote, "They show their flaws, and by doing so they prove their greatness. We showed only strength, and by doing so we proved our weakness." Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. News spread quickly through the camps. Some prisoners watched newsreels within days. Jaws slack as images filled the screen. 6,000 ships crossing the channel, 11,000 aircraft overhead, 150,000 men storming the beaches. They saw artificial harbors assembled in days, supply lines delivering thousands of tons daily. Feldwebel Hans Schmidt whispered to his bunkmate, "We thought America weak. We thought them divided. But this is the end, not only of the war, of everything we believed. It was the final confirmation." Germany had staked its future on racial mythology and military conquest. America had staked its power on industry, democracy, and the freedom of ordinary citizens to prosper. The result was undeniable. The months that followed deepened the transformation. German prisoners worked alongside Italian service units, former enemies now given better pay, better freedom, and even access to American towns. They watched Italians eat in restaurants, some even dating American women. Feldwebel Friedrich Schultz recorded bitterly, "They betrayed us, yet the Americans treat them better than we treated them as allies. This democracy we mocked is more honorable than our Reich." The greatest shock came not from machines or harvests, but from humanity. Prisoners expected cruelty, vengeance. Instead, they received penicillin for infections, surgeries for wounds, counseling for trauma. American officers delivered condolences when families died in bombings. Churches sent packages to German families still trapped in the Reich. Unteroffizier Otto Meyer wrote in disbelief, "They separate the people from the regime. They say they fight Hitler, not us. And they prove it by feeding our children while they bomb our cities. Who are these people?" By the war's end, the numbers told the story. Over 371,000 German POWs lived in camps across America. Fewer than 1% ever tried to escape. Surveys showed that the vast majority rated their treatment as good or excellent. Many left with lasting friendships, some even returning after the war to settle in the United States. But the deeper legacy was ideological. Men who arrived believing in German superiority left convinced of its bankruptcy. They had witnessed with their own eyes that prosperity came not from conquest, but from freedom, not from racial purity, but from diversity, not from dictatorship, but from democracy. Hans Kroll, who later became West Germany's ambassador to the U.S., wrote in his memoirs, "We saw that democracy produced abundance. We saw that treating men with dignity increased production. These were lessons no book could teach. We learned them in the fields and factories of America." The war ended in May 1945. Trains began carrying prisoners back to Germany. They returned to a land in ruined cities shattered, families starving, a nation broken. But they carried something else home, knowledge. They had seen America. They had seen what free people could build. They had lived in a society that fed them better as prisoners than they had ever eaten as soldiers. And they carried those lessons into the rubble. Many became teachers, engineers, officials, farmers, men who rebuilt West Germany with methods learned in captivity. The economic miracle of the 1950s was not born only from the Marshall Plan, it was born also from the memories of POWs who had walked through Kansas wheat fields, who had worked under Texas suns, who had seen German names carved into American prosperity. 4 decades later, in 1985, hundreds of former prisoners returned to America for a reunion in Texas. They visited the towns where they had once arrived in chains, shook hands with farmers whose fields they had once harvested, embraced families who had once treated them as enemies. One man, now old and stooped, stood before the crowd. He had been a young corporal in 1943, a believer in Nazi destiny. Now he spoke with a voice cracked by age but clear with conviction. We came as enemies. We left as friends. We saw with our own eyes that the strength of a nation is not in conquest, but in creation, not in hatred, but in humanity. We learned that prosperity grows from freedom, and freedom grows from dignity. That was America's greatest weapon. Applause thundered. Americans and Germans together, once foes, now united in remembrance. So when the German POWs discovered American farmers with German names, they discovered more than kinship. They discovered the future, a future where their children would grow up not under banners of tyranny, but under the promise of democracy. A future where Germany itself would rise again, this time not in conquest, but in partnership. And if you followed this journey through all its parts, thank you. These stories of transformation, of enemies who became witnesses to democracy, remind us that history is not just battles and numbers, it is human lives, changed forever. If you'd like to hear more untold stories of World War II, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep these memories alive.